Hey,
Hello.
how was your week this week?
It's been good.
Yeah?
Yeah. Nice week.
Nothing
Shorter,
exciting?
shorter week because of some in-service.
Oh,
So,
okay, you guys
nice.
had some meetings, huh?
Yes, but they gave us just a half day, so it was
Oh.
good.
Well, I guess it's better than nothing.
Yeah. Good morning.
Good, how are you? Doing pretty good. I'm doing what I do.
Get any resolution or ideas?
Yeah, they're.
Good morning. How are y'all? I'm thinking.
Where we are? Thanks for the feedback. Hopefully, we tried anything. Still, following. Yeah. You'll go
Well, they said something about, no. Yeah, so they're not gonna. I'm sure they did nice job.
Yeah.
I know, it's so up and down, I know. Oh, wow, so it is gonna, well, especially we've been trying to get this done in years, but it ain't working. Me neither, Brian. I know. I didn't get any questions.
I know, I was, and what I love about it is the dual choice, trying to find the shift while the other story was trying to get safety alive, like, that much, grit. Yeah.
We finally watched that one.
Oh, Endurance?
Yeah, so good.
Wasn't that good? That was really fast.
I've read the book with my students 6 or 7 times.
Yeah.
The young readers adapted version of the Shackleton story.
Yeah.
It was cool.
Those guys were made of different stuff back then. I know.
2 years in mind.
Yeah.
Nuts.
Yeah. What's that? And I mean like sub, like negative 30 degrees temperature. Yeah.
Where the high,
Yeah. Yeah. I honestly, I think that in my whole life, the coldest I've ever been in -2 Fahrenheit. Yeah.
We had times for -2 as well.
Yeah.
Or was it?
Yuck. Yeah, that's not for me. Not for me.
I think there was one kid that snuck aboard during South America.
Yeah.
He snuck aboard and had a good time. Yeah. He was the one that had the amputation code.
Oh, yeah.
He like snuck aboard.
Wow. Biggest mistake
Great
of life.
decision, but
Yeah. Yeah, the fact that Shackleton tried to go back later, that he wanted to keep doing it.
like a magnet.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an American Arctic and Antarctic explorer named Admiral Byrd, Rear Admiral Byrd, and his claim to fame was he was a very, very early pilot, right? Very early in flying history, and his claim to fame was he was the first person to fly over the South Pole and the North Pole as well. And he was an American, so he's kind of our Arctic hero from that age of adventure and exploration. So that people back then were just made of different stuff. Yeah. We've done chapter 4. We're going to be on chapter 13. Chapter 13. Doing okay, Andrew?
Yes,
Good. I'm doing really well. Yeah. What's that? No, it's just water. It's just water. Well, let's go and get started 5 minutes early. My lesson at 9 was shorter than I thought it would be. Some of you are thinking, thankfully. I don't know that we really need to stretch out Exodus 25 through 40 any more than we did. So I'm going to go ahead and steal that 5 minutes back for class. So let's go ahead and get started with a word of prayer. And we are in Mark chapter 13, verse 12. We're about halfway through this chapter on what lines up with what we call the Olivet Discourse from Matthew chapter 24. And we're going to keep going here through this discourse of Jesus before we get to chapter 14. Chapter 14, like this is where things start getting to the end. Passover week, betrayal. Yeah, this is where things start to circle up. All right, so let's have a quick word of prayer and we'll get here into Mark chapter 13. Our Heavenly Father, thank you again for all of your blessings. You are a great and mighty God. You are the giver of all good gifts. You are the creator of life. You are the creator of all the material universe and all the elements. And we thank you so much for the divine wisdom in arranging things the way that they are. We thank you for our class period and pray that we use it well, that our minds and our hearts would be engaged in your word. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, just to sum up where we've been, you're here. You're here. Gene and Rebecca, it's so good to see you. So good to see you. I assume you're feeling a little bit better today. Yeah, we're very happy you're here. Glad you're here. Okay, so to sum things up here in Mark 13 of what we looked at so far, they're in Jerusalem. His disciples start to point out all the highlights, like, oh, this building over here and that building over there. And Jesus, kind of morbidly, just out of the blue says, yep, there's not going to be a stone left on top of the other. Everything's going to be destroyed. And that's a pretty shocking statement, given that there's a temple there, and this is the city of David, and there's so much history here. And why would God, just before the Messianic reign, destroy the capital city of the people of Israel? It's a little bit out of the blue, isn't it? But really not, given the historical and political climate and where things seem to be heading in that direction. And so they ask him specifically in verse 4 of this no stone being left on top of the other, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? And Jesus proceeds to explain that there's going to be war and rumors of war, earthquakes and famines. But don't worry about war and famine. That's not the sign of the end of the times. That's just birth pains. That's just the world just being a fallen, broken world. But he says, be on your guard in verse 9, because what's going to happen is, before the end of Jerusalem is going to become a hotbed of religious hypocrisy and persecution, and they're going to deliver you up to courts. They'll arrest you. Don't be anxious about that. God will give you what you need to say in that moment. Brother will deliver brother to death, father his child. Children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. Look at verse 13 now. And again, this lines up with, this is from Matthew 10. And so for whatever reason, and I don't doubt Mark or question him at all, but for whatever reason, either Jesus said something chronologically that occurs much earlier, and Mark is now kind of taking it out and applying it here as a thematic connection, or Jesus makes similar statements on multiple occasions, and this is just something that he happens to say at the Olivet Discourse, as well as the setting of back in Matthew 10. Both are perfectly plausible. There's no reason not to think Jesus said similar things on different occasions. There's also no reason not to think that Mark, who frequently combines things thematically rather than chronologically, takes a section out of time and says, while we're on the subject, Jesus also said this about the persecution that you're going to be facing. So either one is a perfectly reasonable explanation. But he says in verse 13, and you will be hated by all on account of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. Okay, let's talk about verse 13 a little bit. I want to open it up for a little bit of, a few minutes of discussion here. Does verse 13 have a direct application to every single believer for all time? Is every single believer going to be hated by everybody on account of the name of Jesus? No. Now, specifically to them, the disciples, especially Peter, James, John, Andrew, the ringleaders of this whole Nazarene movement, are they going to probably feel at times like it's them against the world? Yeah. Just read the book of Acts, and Acts gives you a very, very clear picture of what life in Jerusalem was like. Did they go and heal someone in Acts chapter 3, a lame man outside of the temple? And what is the response of the Sanhedrin Council and the authorities? To grab the ringleaders and let's put them in a deposition. When you go and heal a man and the next thing that happens is you get deposed for it, that's a good indication. Things get worse and worse and worse. Peter gets thrown in prison. What ends up happening to James, the brother of John? What happens to James? What does Herod do to James? He beheads him. Yeah, he beheads him. What does Saul of Tarsus think of all of this? After Stephen gets stoned to death, well, where's Saul of Tarsus in all of this? Rounding him up. Yeah. I mean, Acts chapter 7 says he was in hearty agreement. Going into from Acts chapter 7, where he was holding their garments, then going into chapter 8, Saul was in hearty agreement with this, and he became like the attack dog of the Sanhedrin Council. He was the spear point of the Pharisees' attempt at destroying the Jesus followers. So for his disciples, there were times where they felt like it was the whole world standing up against them. And I think that the way that Jesus speaks so sympathetically to them, I think shows the understanding nature of our God. That, yeah, life is going to be really bad sometimes, and you're going to feel like the whole world hates you and that you're the only one. Tell you what, when I was in college, I was not like some people who made that sharp decision to go to Florida College and have a bunch of Christian friends the rest of their life that they could rely on. No, I said that's not for me. I said that's not for me. I want to go to a public university on the West Coast. I'm going to go and test my mettle. The University of Oregon, and then Portland State University. Let's go and see. Yeah. You want to feel like the world is against you? Portland State University has a student body of 25 to 30,000, depending from year to year to year. And I know that, we can be specific to lesser or greater degrees, but as far as, a Christian from what we would consider a sound church, on a campus of 25,000, I was it. You don't feel like the whole world's against you, walking down campus, walking the park blocks in downtown Portland, and it's hairy arm-pitted lesbians protesting everything in the world. Ryan and Katie, watch it. Right in the middle of class. While we're on the subject,
I was going to be a visitor walking in.
Talking about feeling like the whole world is against you, and like you're alone in the world, and you're the only one holding the light of Jesus Christ up. Living on a college campus on the West Coast. That's what it is. Yeah.
We'll stay out of Portland.
Yeah. At least don't send your kids to college. Okay. So more application though, right? I mean, that is an extreme example. Okay. How else do you see an application? The whole world will hate you on account of my name. What's the application to you? Okay. How do you read this person? Because I do think that there's lesser and greater degrees of this. There are different environments where we may feel more or less like the world is against us. But in what sense, can every Christian for all time, read this verse and go, yeah, I get that. What's the application? Yeah, Stacy.
I definitely think with your family, because your family literally is your whole world.
Yeah.
And especially from my perspective, both my parents are gone.
Yeah.
And I cannot imagine how that is for someone who, if your whole family is worldly and sinful and are not Christian, and then you decide, you know what, I'm going to follow after Christ, that's like feeling the whole world is against you, because those are the very number one people that you love, that you've been a part of, and now you're completely opposite of each other. You don't have those things in common.
Yeah.
It becomes very difficult. So you would feel like the whole world is against you when it's coming to that.
And it does make things that you always took for granted to be very awkward, right? You always thought, Christmas time, Thanksgiving, holidays, birthdays. And then, so what happens on New Year's Eve when your family wants to have a get-together and get slobbering drunk on New Year's Eve? Suddenly you've got a choice to make now, right? And you get to be the lonely one who leaves early, or if you're brave enough, maybe you stand up for something and make everybody feel really awkward and uncomfortable. Thanks a lot. So you can feel that just even in your own family, you can feel there's an isolation. And Jesus even talks about that in verse 11, verses 11 and 12, who's going to be the one that delivers you up in verse 12? What does verse 12 say? Who delivers you up? Your own brother. Your own brother delivers you up. So that's a good point. What's another application here? It's kind of feeling alone, the world's against you. Jacob?
I think even not being in Portland, even being in what we refer to as the Bible Belt, there's still going to be moral lines that we refuse to cross, and there will be times at work or other places where we stand up and do the right thing. And, that's uncomfortable when you're younger, but then as you grow and you get more mature, you realize that you have the opportunity to teach in those moments. And
Yeah.
what I've usually found is you think it's going to be awkward going into it, but people end up actually respecting you for it. Typically, is what I found, and you can use that as an opportunity to teach.
Yeah, I found, so Rebecca's family is, generally speaking, not religious at all. And they're not morally evil people per se. So, and we get along well. Like all of my Rebecca side of the family, when we have family get-togethers, they're very nice people, and we always have a pleasant time. But it is interesting how, like, they know, like, when Ryan married into this family, like, oh, wow, we have a preacher in the family now. What do we do with that? And so it's like, I remember the first couple of Thanksgivings that we had, the first side of the family, they're like, well, Ryan, I suppose you'll want to say a benediction of some kind, so the floor is yours. And there's all these assumptions. I've done everybody's weddings now, because it's like, well, now we've got a preacher in the family. I guess we got someone to do all the weddings for all the cousins. But it's like, I found that, like, when I hold the line on things, I don't drink, and they know that. And it's interesting how when Rebecca and I and Susan also, when we do big family get-togethers, we know that out of respect for us, they're holding back. And that, well, we can do all the drinking tomorrow until Ryan and Rebecca are gone, right? And they know that. And I think generally speaking, people will respect it that you speak a different way. You guard your language more than the average person. And I think people will, like, they might not want to do it. They might not want to join you in it, but like, hey, listen, I really respect, I see the way you're a good husband, good father, good husband, or good wife, good mother. Like, I just see the way you got a great family, your kids love and respect you. I really respect the way that you live. I'm not going to do it, but I respect the way that you live. So just kind of like, be prepared for the worst case scenario, which is the whole world will hate you because of the name of Jesus. If you're prepared for the worst case scenario, then anything that's not the worst case scenario is much more tolerable, right? Yeah. Good point, Jacob. Okay, let's go ahead and proceed then. So let's go to verse 14. Can I get a volunteer to read this next section, 14 through 23? Mark 13, 14 through 23. Who wants to get that for me? Go ahead.
But when ye see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for the women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as had not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being will be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand.
Thank you, Kathy. So, again, I think sometimes, we do live in an environment where rapture, fiction, the Left Behind series, that stuff is very popular. To this day, still is popular. It surprises me that it continues to be as popular as it is. But I suppose with Israel being in the news so much the last couple of years, this like Zionistic expectation of the rapture and the tribulation and all that, I think it's just more present for people because of things going on in the news. And it's easy to read passages like this and go, well, yeah, I mean, look, he's explaining the whole thing. But again, keeping it in its context, what is the scope of the questions that the disciples are asking? You said Jerusalem is going to be torn down, not one stone left on top of the other. Can you please explain that? They didn't ask about anything else. especially the way Mark presents it. Now, Matthew is much longer, and I think there's more information there, and I think it's easier in Matthew to kind of look at like, okay, maybe there are some things there in Matthew that you could say are end of the world stuff. From a certain point of view, you can understand them to be end of the world stuff. But Mark is very pointed in how he's presenting this. When will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? They are asking about the destruction of Jerusalem. That's what they're asking. That is the information Jesus is giving. And so when you understand it from that perspective, I do think it makes a lot more sense. He's not talking about the tribulation, the end of the world, all this stuff in premillennial rapture fiction. He is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And for the people who live in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, Rome coming is going to be absolutely cataclysmic. Okay? The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD was not just your typical like Roman drop the hammer. It was you know what, guys? We've been dealing with these Jews in Judea for like 150 years now. They're always fomenting. They're always causing trouble. It's always political unrest there. There's all these like groups and zealots, and I'm done. Rome is done. By 70 AD, Rome's done. We're just done. We're done with it. And they obliterate the city of Jerusalem. They obliterate it so much that the Romans have to come back and they rebuild the city of Jerusalem under a different name, and it is a completely different city. I mean, like a completely different city built from the ground up. A completely different city. Different layout, different buildings, different streets, different names. Totally different because it is that demolished. Not one stone left on top of the other. So Jesus is saying, I'm warning you in advance, this is happening. So what do you think about this phrase, the desolation of abomination? A lot of meaning behind that. What's kind of place number one? Where do you go to kind of understand? Okay, when we talk about abomination of desolation, what's that a callback to? Does anybody know? Okay, Daniel chapter 9. Okay, in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's prophecy talks about how they're given this like 426-year history there. It's in the weeks. The weeks being a symbol for like 1 week is 7 years, and he talks about, it's about basically a 426-year history that he gives there in number symbolism. And he talks about how there's going to be this so-called abomination of desolation. Now, in the first century, does anybody know, like historically, what did the Jews consider to be the abomination of desolation in their fairly recent history? Does anybody know what that event was that they kind of pointed to as the abomination of desolation? There was a ruler who came in who used to, of the Seleucids. I should go back. I should make you read a book. After the empire of Alexander the Great falls, what happens to Alexander's empire? It's divided up into 5 parts and left to his top generals, his chiefs. And so one of his generals takes over what is like modern day Syria, Turkey, okay? And that becomes the Seleucid Empire. And a ruler of the Seleucid Empire, and the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, where are the Ptolemies located? Egypt, okay? So the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids up in like what would again be modern day Syria, southern Turkey, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies all want Judea because it's like the crossroads. And so for a while the Seleucids will take over and rule it, and then the Ptolemies will kick them out. And then the Seleucids will come back and kick them out. And then the Ptolemies will come and kick them out. And there's this jostling match, right, that's going on in Judea. And finally, the Maccabees rise up. Judas Maccabee, along with his brothers, they rise up and they lead this guerrilla campaign against the Seleucids and kick them all out. And the I guess you could call it the flashpoint for all of this was the Seleucids leader was a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, Antiochus Epiphanes entered Jerusalem, went straight to the temple, and started defaming the temple. I mean, he did horrible things to it. He sacrificed pigs. He looted the temple, and he was burning pigs on the altar. Like, anything he could do to just absolutely defame the temple, he was doing it. And so when the Maccabees led this guerrilla campaign and retook Judea, they cleansed the temple. And they looked back in Daniel and they said, you know what? That Daniel 9 reference to the abomination of desolation, I bet that was Antiochus Epiphanes. He did the abomination of desolation by coming and abominating our temple. And we had to clean the temple out and rededicate the temple, which is, of course, where the whole story of Hanukkah comes in. They had to rededicate the temple and clean it out because of what the abomination of desolation did to us. So that is what first century Jews regarded to be the abomination of desolation. So when Jesus pulls this phrase out, it's already a phrase that's impregnated with a lot of history and meaning. And the meaning is armies invading Jerusalem and despoiling the temple. So when he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, everybody there goes, wait, what? Didn't we already have an abomination of desolation? There's got to be another one? Oh, no. That phrase is meant to be like when we say 9/11. When any of us say 9/11, what does that conjure up to all of us? The panic and the fear on that day. What's going to be bombed next? What, planes falling out of the sky? Is this going to turn into full-scale war? Like, that day was a day of, like, panic. And it's got, when I say 9/11, all of us who lived through 9/11, we know that that's full of meaning. Well, abomination of desolation was full of meaning for them. And Jesus purposefully pulled that phrase out of Daniel as like a callback to, you remember the way that Jerusalem and the temple were abominated and despoiled because of what happened there. Go ahead, Stacey.
Okay, I was gonna say, and I don't want this to be long-winded, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around the whole situation. So don't mind if I summarize it up. Basically, they're walking along. The apostles say to Jesus, because Jesus is there with them, when is the temple? He says, I'm going to destroy the temple, basically. And they ask him, when is the temple going to be destroyed? When is it going to be the end, basically, for Jerusalem? And he tells him that he gives them these signs of when it's going to come. And basically, he's going to destroy, that everything is going to be destroyed and that Christians are going to be persecuted. Is that right? Because this is the time when they burn Christians alive, they sacrifice Christians, they do all these things. Is that right? Okay. So I'm just trying to get it in my mind. So when he's saying some will be on the rooftop, some will be, and there will be pregnant women, let it not be in winter, and all of these things, and he tells them, run for the hills. Don't go back and grab anything from your house. Don't go back and get anything. You run. When you see these signs about to happen, they are coming for you. Yes. Correct?
Yes.
Rome is going to come and get you and persecute you and tear you up. So whatever you do, just go.
Yes.
Just run. It's not that anybody's literally going to be taken from the rooftop and go to heaven while the other one is still down here on earth. Is that correct?
Yes, that's how I would take it. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, this has nothing to do with us. Is that right? And the perception of, it seems like to me, he's just talking to the Jews and Jerusalem.
Yes, in a very specific time.
Right. At the end of their time, of their village. I don't want to say village, but I can't think of another word. So it's like if he said, oh, this is going to happen to America. And these are the signs coming up to when America is going to be destroyed, and this is what you need to do before that, or when you see that.
Yeah, that would be like a parallel of what it would sound like. Yeah, right. Not that that's what he is saying, but that would be a parallel. Yeah.
Right. But the world takes it like this is the end of the world, and some are going to be left here on earth, when really. It has nothing to do with the end of the world. It has to do with Jerusalem being destroyed and Christians being persecuted.
Yeah, and the Judaism.
And only reason why I'm summarizing it up is because I've struggled with that whole chapter for a while. Like, it does kind of say that, because when you talk to other people, you know, they will make you feel like, no, this is the end of the world. This is how it's going to be. And
think about a a lot of people who are premillennial look at that interpretation and they say, yeah, but I mean, he's using like really, really big language. He seems to be making a big deal about what, just one city being destroyed, Jerusalem, but that's not what it represents. What 70 AD represents in the destruction of Jerusalem is the end of a 2,000-year process that stretches all the way back, right? And there's all this history on Mount Zion. There's all of this like culture and religion going all the way back to Abraham offering his son Isaac, right? And so it is not just the end of a city. It is the end of an entire paradigm, the end of a covenant, the closing of a covenant to give way to the new covenant that's been put in place. It is the transfer of God's allegiance from a people and a special city and a temple that will hold my glory to the world, and the church is my temple, and there's not a building in this world that could ever contain my glory. And the earth now is my footstool, right? And not that the earth hasn't always been his footstool, but it's a paradigm shift. It's a focus shift away from the way that things were to the way that things are and going to be in eternity in heaven. 70 AD is a monumental shift in terms of religious history and in terms of the imagery in the Bible as well. And there were people who stayed in Jerusalem, by the way, to the bitter end. There were people who holed up in the temple itself. That was the last building to go. When all the rest of the city was taken, there was a small group still holed up in the temple saying, God's always rescued us at the last second before. He's always managed to pull victory from the jaws of defeat. Remember Sennacherib and Hezekiah and the angel wiped out all those Assyrian soldiers? Like, everybody, he's going to do it again, right? And then he didn't. And he didn't.
But they were warned.
Yes, they were warned. And if the abomination of desolation is still confusing, well, okay, that's weird. Interestingly enough, Luke, in his account of the Olivet Discourse, actually just plainly says it, where Jesus uses a symbol, a Daniel 9 symbol, like when you see the abomination of desolation, then run for the hills. You go, well, what could the abomination of desolation be? Luke does not use the phrase abomination of desolation. In Luke 21 and verse 20, he just says it plainly. He gives the explanation. Instead of saying, when you see the abomination of desolation, he just says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then understand that her desolation is at hand. So if you're still confused, like, well, I don't get the abomination of desolation, Luke just basically plainly says it, like, when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, that's what's going on. When you see General Titus, son of the Emperor of Rome, and that Titus was the one who led the destruction of Jerusalem, he becomes emperor, I think, like the very next year or something. But when you see Titus at the head of a Roman army and they are starting to surround Jerusalem, that is not your time to hunker down and go, well, let's get ready for a siege and God will rescue us, just like he did with Hezekiah. Nope. No. When you see the Roman army come, that's it. Jerusalem's done. Get out. Get out while you can. Run. Head for the hills. Don't take any stuff. Don't go home. Go. Run. And if you're faithful and you take that opportunity when the opportunity is there, the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. He'll save your life. Your life will be saved because you knew to get up and run.
And to be clear, one of the reasons that we're taking so much time to explain this is because, I don't know if we've actually mentioned this, but it's often one of these passages people go to talk about the Antichrist.
Yeah.
That is, and that's why we're taking the time to put it in historical context.
Yeah, I don't want, if anybody's bored in here, like I get it, this is, Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, without understanding kind of the context of it, it is easily a confusable, it's a confusing passage. And I think people sometimes read these passages and go, I don't get it, I'm just moving on. And like, they just kind of have like this is a little weird, it's maybe a little above my head, I don't get it, I'm moving on. It really isn't that complicated. It is, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and that represents the end of something. It is a cataclysmic finality to a millennia-long covenant that God had with a people in a specific place, a specific people, with the focal point being the temple in Jerusalem, and that is gone. It is over. It is finished, and that's a huge shift. Brent, and then we'll move on.
Yeah. So the reason I think this is so critical, I came from that background, right? The premillennialism background. It's critical for one to understand that if you can get this, you can wrap your mind around that. There's going to be a judgment day when Christ comes back.
Yeah.
There's not this, oh, well, he's going to take these people and give these people 1,000 years to get it together. So if I miss it on the first time, I'll get it on the second. That's critical for people to understand. You have one life, and his mercy and grace is get it right. And I'm trying to help you, and I'm warning you, and I'm putting all these things around. That's critical number one. Critical number two is, remember that Mark, Luke, and John were written to different audiences, right?
Yeah.
The Jews never understood that Jesus was the Son of God. They still struggle with that. And so when we as people who are Christians today talk about, there's this battle over there, we got to support the Jews and be against the Palestinians, and I'm thinking to myself, do Christians really understand that neither one of them believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? How do you take a side with that?
Yeah.
They're both wrong. And we sit up here with all this banter and talk, and really, we should just hold what the Bible says and say, guess what? Anyone who doesn't believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God is wrong. You can't take a side in that.
Yeah.
They're both wrong. And so we get messed up as Christians. I'm feeling some prophecy, and we got to stand with somebody. Stand with the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is interesting, the Zionist movement, turn of the previous century, not 2000, but 1900, that Zionist movement is so interwoven, politics and religion and Israel and post-World War II, Reconstruction, and it's just I don't want to make this into a big class on all that, but it is interesting to see the way that the politics and the religion of Zionism latched on to so much from Matthew 24, Daniel 9, the book of Revelation, just latched on to Ezekiel. There's so much that they latched on to that causes you to actually miss what the point is. And the point is that there was the end of a covenant, and God said, essentially, as long as the symbols of this covenant continue to exist, people will always have a hard time moving on. As long as there's a temple in Jerusalem, people are going to cling to it. As long as there's an altar to sacrifice on, they're going to want to keep sacrificing. As long as there's a priesthood, they're going to turn to the priest instead of the true high priest, Jesus. It is time to cut it off and end it and destroy it and move on. Otherwise, people will just keep clinging to it. And you're right, Brent, that when premillennialists and Zionists cling to Jerusalem with this notion of Jesus is going to come back for a 1,000-year reign, he's going to be in Jerusalem on a throne, it's like you are trying to cling on to the very thing that God was wiping off the table, right? He was clearing the board of temples and Jerusalem, and you'll not worship on this mountain, you'll not worship on that mountain, true worshipers worship in spirit. And he was clearing the board. And then we pounce back onto the pieces on the ground and go, yeah, but not this one. This one's great. Look at it.
I can delete it.
I gotta vote for someone because this piece, we might want that piece. Like, yeah, you've missed the point then. Yeah, what's the true temple? What's true Jerusalem? The new heavens and the new earth coupled with New Jerusalem in Revelation 21. The New Jerusalem is not a city with a temple. It's not. Go ahead, Jeff.
And then historical clarification.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times we have this idea that Nero came in and sent Titus and destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70, and then AD 71 came in and rebuilt it. That's not the case.
Yeah.
It wasn't until AD 32 the Jews were still in. A lot of Jews were still in Jerusalem, and they revolted in AD 32, and Emperor Hadrian came in 1835 and completely obliterated it off the map.
Yeah.
Drove them all out, all the Jews out of Jerusalem, and he rebuilt Jerusalem then. It wasn't rebuilt back in the 80-70 timeframe, it was 80.
Is the early
85
second century.
timeframe.
Yeah.
And at that time, he also banned Jews from Jerusalem. In fact, it was a capital offense for a Jew to be seen within eyesight of the city at that time.
Yeah. So it was really the first cataclysmic beginning of a longer process.
Right.
I mean, you can't compel tens or hundreds of thousands of people to leave a region overnight. Yeah, you can't. That's not going to happen overnight. What was the name? What is the name that the Romans, when they rebuilt Jerusalem? I'm having a hard time remembering what the name was.
Capitolina.
Yeah. What was it?
I won't say it right, but Aelia Capitolina.
Yeah. That's what. Yeah.
Also, the name Palestine was given by the Romans as
Yeah.
well. It's a derivative of Philistine. It's almost mocking Jews.
Yeah. Yeah. And Jerusalem was rebuilt as a completely different city.
And as a Roman colony.
As a Roman colony. The structures were Roman. The accommodations were Roman. The bathhouses. It was a Roman city. Yeah. Completely different city. Yeah. So this was part of a much longer process. But AD 70 was the thunderclap. It was the thunderclap. Okay, so let's go on here. Let's go to verse 24 now. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will be falling from the heaven. Again, a lot of people look at that and go like, surely that's end of the world stuff, isn't it? No, it's still not really end of the world stuff. In the Old Testament, God often uses cosmic cataclysm as symbols to represent the end of nations, the destruction of nations. And specifically, when you read verses 24 and 25, that's actually a quote from Isaiah. And there's several passages in Isaiah. I'm going to write them down here. Just you can read them on. This is not an Isaiah class, so I don't want to sit and dwell on this too much. But Isaiah chapter 13, and specifically verse 10, and then later on chapter 24. I think it's verses 21 and 22. And these are not the only examples of this, but they're at least illustrative of what we're talking about. In Isaiah 13, he's specifically talking about the destruction of Babylon, okay? Specifically. And he even states it at the beginning of the chapter. He says, this is the judgment against, or the oracle concerning Babylon. And then he goes on throughout the chapter and says, of Babylon, right? The end of Babylon, not the end of the world, but the end of the empire of Babylon. He says in verse 9, the day of the Lord is coming. And remember, in the prophets, if you've gone through the prophet studies, minor prophets especially, the day of the Lord is not the end of the world. What does the day of the Lord mean? When you see that phrase in the prophets, what does day of the Lord mean? Judgment. Yeah, it's God's judgment, all right? And there have been lots of days of the Lord. And it depends on who you are. You know, your day of the Lord is the Philistines, or your day of the Lord is Babylon, or the day of the Lord for whatever nation happens to be. The day of the Lord is the day that God comes to your people and judges your people. That's the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord is coming in verse 9, looking for Babylon. And when Babylon falls, look at verse 10 of Isaiah 13. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. Is he talking about like dimming the moon and the stars? No. He's using cataclysmic language as a symbolic or figurative way of saying your world is coming to an end. Not the world physically is coming to an end, but your world. Your way of thinking, your government, your politics, your culture, your language. Does anybody today speak ancient Babylonian language? Is it Akkadian? No. Nobody speaks ancient Babylonian or Assyrian or Akkadian languages. Babylon's world was coming to an end. Their stars in the heaven were going to come down and crash. Their kings would fall. Their language would fall. Their culture would fall. Their political system would fall. Your whole world will crash down. So when God uses this language, like here in Mark 13, that in those days the sun will be dark and the moon will be dark and the stars will not give their light, he's not saying like, oh no, the heavens are going to start exploding and falling apart and the moon's not going to reflect. He's saying that's the end of your world. your little world that you have, the world that makes sense to you. And when Jerusalem is destroyed and there's no more temple and no more priesthood and no more sacrifices and no more genealogy, because inconveniently enough, when Jerusalem was destroyed, all their paperwork was gone too. All their records, their genealogies. So when your genealogy and your city and your temple and your priesthood and your sacrificial system are all gone, your world is over. Your world is destroyed. So he uses that language, again, as figurative and symbolic of a world coming to an end. And in verse 26, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And again, you can disagree. That's fine. There's different ways of interpreting it. I don't think this is a salvation issue. I don't think this is you're a heretic if you think one way or the other. I still think that there is an argument that makes a lot of sense that we're still not talking about the end of the world here. Because even Jesus himself talks about the Son of Man coming on a cloud, and he's not talking about the end of the world. He's talking about coming in a limited kind of judgment. In Matthew 26, verse 64, when the priests are confronting him and saying, "Tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of God?" And in Matthew 26, verse 64, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Is he talking about the end of the world there? No. I mean, that'd be so weird and out of the blue and non sequitur to just suddenly blurt out like, "And I'm going to judge the world." But like, that's not what he's talking about. He is saying that you're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds in the sense of you're going to see your judgment coming. Your judgment's coming. And the Son of Man sits on the clouds. He rules above this world. It's a Psalm 2 thing here. Psalm 110. He's got a mighty scepter. And he rules over this universe. He sits on the clouds and rules. And so you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds when his judgment comes upon you. And in verse 27, then he'll send forth the angels. Remember, the word angel literally means messengers. And it's a choice of a translator to look at the word and say, I'm going to call that angel. Because angel is imbued with a lot of supernatural elements to it. But if the word angel literally just means messenger, is it possible, I'm saying, is it possible that instead of sending out angels and plucking people up from their beds, is he maybe talking about preachers going forth, Christians going out into all the world, the messengers, the representatives, the angels of God, we being messengers and representatives? Is he saying the angels of God will go out and gather together his elect through preaching? They're going to go spread the gospel to the four winds from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. And people are going to hear the messengers of God preaching the gospel and will be gathered as the elect into his church. So I still don't think we're talking about the end of the world stuff here. That's just me. You can disagree. That's fine. But as I said, my rule for understanding the Olivet Discourse, like my general rule is, wherever possible, if there is a way to understand it in the context of 70 AD and destruction of Jerusalem, I'm going to keep it in that context. I'm going to go with that interpretation because it's the tidiest, cleanest, simplest way to understand it. And you don't end up with all these like non sequiturs that you have to figure out like, okay, well, why is that the end of the world? If you can explain it as judgment upon Jerusalem, it just makes the most sense to do that. All right, anything through verse 27 before we look at these couple of parables here at the close of the chapter? Anything else you want to add there?
Well, I just agree that you need to look at the context.
Yeah.
Because I was not looking at the context. I was just picking that out from there and saying, oh, he's going to come in the clouds and the angels and blah, 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 blah. But if you read it in its context and then the question that was asked, why would he go to a whole other subject? He's literally answering the question that was asked. Lord, when are these things going to happen? And then he tells them, look for this, look for that, blah, 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 blah. So I absolutely agree with you. I believe that if you're looking at its context, it doesn't make sense to jump to another subject.
Yeah. And, the phrase in verse 27, will gather together his elect, that phrase in prophetic language is not a literal phrase. It's not literally gathering. It's that God, as a non-corporeal, all-powerful spiritual being who is in all places at all times, can God gather together in a non-literal sense? Sure he can. Does God know the registry of those who are part of his kingdom right now? I mean, what does Hebrews chapter 12 say about that? Does God know who is in his kingdom? Sure. Has he non-literally, symbolically gathered all people into his church? Of course he has. Zephaniah 3 and verse 8, Zephaniah in the Old Testament, therefore wait for me, declares the Lord, for the day when I rise up to pray. Indeed, my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation and all my burning anger, for the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. He is not literally gathering nations to do that. Like that's not. He's not literally creating a rally point in some large stadium and saying, all the nations gather together so I can judge you. He can non-literally gather nations and gather people. Yeah, go ahead, Jenny. I missed you before. You had a comment like 10 minutes ago.
I did, and I'm going to tie it right back on.
Great.
No,
I'm really sorry.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to ask, because that class would possibly end before we got there. So either just to clarify or question something that Stacy had just said. Totally get the abomination of desolation, that just being the Jerusalem, but she had mentioned the being plucked out of the field while one is standing.
Yeah.
And that's referring to later in this chapter, right? Not, like, if you look back in Matthew, that seems to be down here where the no one knows the day or the hour part.
Yeah, and Mark does not dwell upon that. In fact, when you read 28 through 37, yeah, Mark doesn't bring that up.
Right, he doesn't talk about it,
Yeah.
but when looking in the
Matthew
other.
talks.
Matthew talks about it.
Yeah, I kind of read them together. Sorry, Jim.
No, that's okay, but I just wanted to clarify, because I think those two are different scenarios
Yeah.
that he's discussing, yes or no?
I go back and forth on that.
Okay.
I go back and forth. Like, I hear an argument that says all of Matthew 24 is Jerusalem, and I go, okay, that's a reasonable argument. But then somebody later will say, yeah, but what about this? And I go, oh, okay, okay, I see what you mean now. I've changed my mind. I've
Well,
tried.
I just wanted to kind of ask, because when I had read it and she said that, I was like, oh, was that Jerusalem? Because I was reading it the other way.
I will say this. I think that there is not a Matthew 24 class, first of all. But no, hey.
I was like a very judgy one, this guy just tried. Not a Matthew 24 class.
I still believe that there is a way to understand even that last part of Matthew 24. That there will be one person in the field, or two people in the field, one will be plucked up. There will be two people in a room, one will be plucked up. I still think that there is a way to understand and interpret that and keep it in the Jerusalem context.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
Because I was pretty classic.
But I also can see that Matthew is answering an additional question. Right? In Matthew 24, they say, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming? And what will be the sign of the end of the age? Matthew, the disciples actually ask a third question. Mark does not include a third question. They only ask two questions in verse 4. So it is possible that with that third question of what will be the end of the age, that Jesus is expanding the scope to end of the world stuff. And that's a reasonable thing to say. And the explanation is, keep me 30 seconds. The explanation would be, yes, the immediate context is Jerusalem, but it's almost like Jesus is saying, the destruction of Jerusalem is going to be cataclysmic and horrible, and it will be terrible, and I've warned you in advance. But if you think that is cataclysmic, if you think the destruction of a city and its temple and the way of life and a covenant, if you think that is a cataclysm, there is going to be something even larger, bigger, that's going to affect everybody in the whole world. And I'm not going to give you the same warning about, you will not know when that is, because Matthew 24, he does shift away from, here's the sign, run for the hills. Then he shifts to, this thing over here, you don't know when that's going to happen. And you better be prepared right now, because you don't know when it's going to happen. So I think that there's a case to be made for either one. I'm not dogmatic either way. Let's put it that way. Yes, yeah. All right, thank you, everybody. Let's go ahead and, for the sake of time, let's go on to chapter 14. We got to move on. Start chapter 14 on Wednesday night. That's some dense stuff.